not often called legendary, never happened before. And with a name like mine, I suppose I should speak more German than I do, but again, I apologize for that. A lot of friends of mine have said that I've had probably the best job in the world, to spend nearly 50 years inventing drinks brands. It's got to be pretty good, a real pleasure for me. And what I'm about to tell you contains no rocket science, no broken paradigms, no thoughts from outside the box, just simple common sense and I hope clarity. So let me give you a bit of background. I was in advertising when I left university, and this goes back to 1959. Has anybody here been born in 1959? No, I didn't think so. And it wasn't something I particularly enjoyed, although I did have some experience of, which was interesting. I worked a lot on Procter & Gamble and Unilever, very structured, very disciplined, very difficult, very unmotivating. But I did have the experience of working with a charismatic Irishman called Tony O'Reilly, who at the age of 28 was the general manager of the Irish Dairy Board. And he was given the task of transforming Irish butter from a commodity which commanded a very low price to a brand which commanded a decent price. And the agency I worked with produced the brand Kerrygold, which in the 60s was a huge international success, and the brand is still around today. I think it sells in Germany, and it's the spearhead for Irish dairy produce. And this had a huge impact on me and did affect what I did later. But in 1969, I managed to persuade my boss to set up a department. What? Okay. Oh, I see what you mean. Sorry about that. In 1969, I persuaded my boss in advertising to set up a department to develop new brands. And I was lucky enough to meet a man in the drinks business. And he worked for a company called IDV. And IDV became Guinness UDV in 1997, and then it became Diageo again in 1997, which is the biggest drinks company on the planet. Anybody work for Diageo here? One. Oh, hi. Well, I spent a long time developing brands for your company. And I'm going to take you through some stories of brands that I developed in no particular chronological order, but I'll show you the ones that worked and how they happened, the ones that worked for a little bit and the ones that didn't. I will start with 1985. We had a brief to develop a single malt. At that time, IDV had one rather quiet malt brand called Nakando and nothing else. And they wanted to develop a new single malt. And we had a meeting. And during the meeting, the question was raised, why develop a single malt for 3% of all whiskey drinkers, who were the single malt audience, when you could develop one for the other 97? So what we did was we developed a bridge brand between blended whiskey and malt whiskey. And the brand was called the Singleton. Why is it not up? The brand was called the Singleton. The whole solution to that problem was resolved in about an hour between a small team of people who were all involved in the whiskey business. We said, let's develop a malt for blend drinkers. That was agreed. Let's produce an easy drinking malt whiskey. That was agreed. We only looked at one brand name, the Singleton. We only looked at one pack design, the one that you see on the right there. The brand was launched in 1985, and here are some of the figures. It now sold 518,000 cases. It has a turnover of 289 million. I'm told it is the 5th largest selling malt whiskey in the world. And the whole process took a morning, a very short morning. And I'm very proud of that brand because it's hung in there since 1985 and is now very successful. The next one was one of the toughest briefs I ever had. This was in 1990, and it was for the USA. Smirnoff at the time was absolutely on its knees. It was a supermarket vodka. And the two hot brands in the US at the time were Absolut and Stolichnaya. And somebody in the company said, we want to produce a vodka to compete with Absolut and Stoli, which is an incredibly tough ask. It's a bit like Kentucky Fried Chicken going for a Michelin star. It doesn't work like that. It's not that easy. And the conclusion we came to was that the only way that Smirnoff could compete with Absolut and Stoli was to come up with a better product, something that the consumers thought was a better product. Now, given the fact that the rules in vodka are quite tough, it has to be colorless, odorless, and tasteless. How on earth do you come up with something that's different? Well, the answer is you find a new word, and then you build a product to fit the word. And the word we found was smooth. Up at that time, the word for vodka was sharp, dry, piercing, strong, clean, pure. Nobody had ever used the word smooth. So what we did was we said, okay, we're going to do blind taste comparisons between Smirnoff, our product, and Absolut. And what we want to achieve is that 9 out of 10 people choose our product under blind conditions because it's smoother. And we did. The brand was Smirnoff Black. I don't think it's a brand that Diageo were very excited about. I think they have Ciroc. I think they have Kettle One. So Smirnoff Black has, I think, fallen by the wayside. But those are some of its numbers. I still think it's one of the best brands I ever produced, and certainly one of the most difficult briefs. In 2003, Grey Goose was making huge headway in the vodka sector, and the brief from management was to come up with a vodka to compete with Grey Goose. Now, as I said before, I'm a great believer in developing a product that's differentiated, a product that's different. And I got this idea from a visit made to Tbilisi in Georgia about 10 years earlier, when I asked the question, do people drink vodka in Georgia? To which the answer was yes. And I said, well, what's the vodka made of? And they said, grapes. So the basis for Ciroc was that the world's first vodka made from grapes, not grain or potato. Now, I take no credit for Mr. Diddy and his amazing achievement at building the brand. I just simply provided the foundation, which was a grape vodka. Now that does 524,000 cases, 242 million. The idea for grape vodka took, I don't know, a couple of hours, a couple of days, not very long. The next thing was Diageo owned a brand called Bombay Sapphire, but when they got into the process of buying Seagram's, the mergers and acquisitions department said, you have to get rid of Bombay Sapphire. So they sold it to Bacardi for 2.1 billion, I think. And the CEO said, we need a brand to occupy that space, and we need to be on the market in 6 months. And this again was a pretty tough briefing. The idea came in the most unlikely way. We had a meeting at a gin distillery, and there were no chairs in the distillery, so we sat on sacks of dried botanicals. And we were playing around with the botanicals, and I said to the head of the distillery, can you make a gin out of fresh botanicals? To which the answer was, yes, but it'll cost you. And so we developed the world's first fresh botanical gin. And what's quite interesting about that is that I've been around the place talking to people at Diageo saying, why is Tanqueray 10 special? What makes it different? And nobody seemed to know about the fresh botanical story. And what we did was we produced a gin made from fresh botanicals to deliver the benefit of a fresher, cleaner, more refreshing taste. Most gins, as you know, have a rather bitter, almost dirty taste. And Tanqueray 10 has this very fresh, clean taste. Next time you try it, think about that. Now, Tanqueray 10 does 197,000 cases and turns over 98 million. The idea came from 5 minutes in a distillery sitting on a sack of dried juniper berries. Now, I suppose this is going to be the most famous brand I will ever develop. It was called Bailey's Irish Cream. And the reason I showed you that Kerrygold picture early on was had a very strong influence in the development of Bailey's. My partner and I had just set up in business on our own in 1973. I think we'd been in business for about a week. And we had this brief, which was a kind of, we called it the Wexford Whisper, because somebody said to somebody else, who said to somebody else, who said to somebody else, who said to me, we need a new Irish brand for export. It was a weird brief. There were no parameters, no constraints, no limitations on what we could do or use, which is in itself quite a tough way to proceed. So this is how we proceeded. We went down to the local supermarket and bought a bottle of Jameson Irish whiskey, probably the most famous Irish product at that time. And the brief we'd set ourselves was there anything in Kerrygold that could possibly help us to develop a new brand? So we started with Irish whiskey, and we then also bought a tub of cream. We took them back to the office with some excitement and trepidation. We mixed them together, and the result was truly, truly awful. It's one of the most disgusting products I've ever tasted. But we were not undaunted. We went back to the supermarket and looked around and found the magic part of the formula. Was that Cadbury's drinking chocolate. We added some sugar and ended up with that, which was Bailey's Irish Cream. And that was that whole process took about 45 minutes. Well, the supermarket was quite a long way away, so we had to do the second trip. And I called up my client at IDV and said, look, we've got something here. I think it's really, really interesting. Can I bring it over? And he said, sure. So I took it over, and I said, why should drink taste awful? Why shouldn't we produce a drink that actually tastes quite nice? And he tried it, and he said, hey, this is brilliant. I think we're going to do it. Now, nobody knew anything about this. I mean, I'm a complete ignoramus when it comes to developing technology. Nobody knew whether you could mix cream and Irish whiskey. But my client, who was probably a real hero of the piece, decided to take it on. The next thing we had to do was to brand it. And that's where the brand came from. You see the 3 white windows at the top? That was our office, and below it was a restaurant called Bailey's, which wasn't Irish. It had no fixed ethnicity, but it just sounded right. When I dealt with O'Reilly back in the day, he said, never use Irish names, typical Irish names like my own, because they sound whimsical, they don't sound serious. And Bailey's seemed perfect. That was the original Bailey's label, which was designed by my secretary's husband, to a brief on the telephone which said, imagine if Kerrygold did an alcoholic drink, what would it look like? He sent us a dozen labels, and we chose that one. So that's Bailey's. Well, that's my favorite Bailey's design. So that's why I put it here. And those are the scores. 6.6 million cases, 1.5 billion turnover. And if you want to know how much I get per bottle, it's exactly the same as all of you. Nothing at all. But there's, and I've got one more cream thing which I'd like to tell. This one, the idea took 30 seconds. The pitch took 180 seconds. As you can gather, I'm quite long-winded. The buy took 60 seconds. And last year did 305,000 cases and 98 million turnover. It's a brand some of you may have heard of. It's ticked along for over 30 years, and it's called Sheridan's. And the idea came, I was going over to Dublin for the brief, and I saw somebody pouring a pint of Guinness in the bar at Dublin Airport. And I thought, what a great idea for a coffee cream liqueur, something that worked like a Guinness. So I persuaded the company to develop the double bottle with the one hole for the black stuff, which is big and pours quickly, and the white stuff, which pours slowly. And that brand has been around for a hell of a long time. So I hate to think of how much money it's made over time. Now, if you spend as long doing the job as I did, you have a lot of ideas that may succeed for a while, but then disappear without trace. And I'll just show you a few of them. Aqua Libra, we decided in the 80s to look at non-alcoholic drinks because Perrier was doing incredibly well in the UK, and they were selling fizzy water for 69 pence a bottle, which was extraordinary. We developed a herbal drink called Aqua Libra, which went to 1 million cases in about 3 years and was incredibly successful. Unfortunately, it didn't last, but one of the great bonuses of Aqua Libra was that Princess Diana spontaneously said it was one of her favorite drinks. And you couldn't buy that kind of PR. And we didn't. She volunteered it of her own accord. This was another one. I think at that time in my career, every time I walked into a pub, nobody was drinking any of my products. All they were drinking was beer. So I thought, well, is there an opportunity to produce a product that can compete with beer? So we developed a brand called St. Ledger, which was, I think, the first Alco Pop, or at least was the same time as California Cooler. St. Ledger was a 3% alcohol by volume. It was orange juice, mineral water, and white wine. And it set the whole trend, I think, for Alco Pops, which came in various iterations over the years. J&B is a very interesting whiskey brand. In the 60s, it was the #1 in the US. It is an enormous brand in the Spanish market, but in the UK, it barely exists. And it has a very strange image, J&B. It's not a traditional whiskey. I remember doing research in China, And somebody said, oh, it reminds us of biker's whiskey. It wasn't traditional, it wasn't classic. And in the 80s, I developed an extension to J&B Rare, which was called J&B Jet, which opened a new sector in, of all places, the Korean market, the modern on-trade. It was a whiskey for young, modern professionals in IT. It wasn't an old man's whiskey. It was the young man's whiskey, and that was Jet. It became a huge success in South Korea, and they asked to follow it about 5 years later. And I think in any category in which you operate, you should always be looking for a different product. How can you produce a product that changes the rules, moves the game on? So I came up with J&B Sub-Zero, which is the world's first whiskey designed to be served straight from the freezer. If anyone's ever had whiskey straight from the freezer, it's a completely different experience. Presented it to the Koreans in the 90s. They absolutely hated it. What they were after was 17-year-old J&B, which wasn't part of the company's strategy, but I think it was interesting. And I think it'll come again. I think frozen whiskey is a very attractive idea. Here's one, I suppose, if there are any French people here, it's at your expense. The UK is not a natural wine market. It never was. It wasn't part of the DNA of English drinking behavior. And in the 70s and late 60s, the French dominated. And we were asked to see whether we could produce a French wine, a branded French wine, which the French would say, sacre bleu, it's not possible. You can't have branded wine. But the problem with French wine was the names are too complex and the products were too difficult to drink. So what we decided to do was to look for a French branding that was easy to recognize and produce a wine that was easy to drink. So I used as the model for the wine your own Blue Nun. I took a bottle of Blue Nun, I poured it into a claret bottle, I added red food coloring, and I took it to a French winemaker and said, I want you to produce a French wine that tastes like that. We did. The wine became Le Pied d'Or. It was a huge success in the UK, in Canada and Japan. It never went anywhere near France. The Americans rejected it because the guy who ran the American company was a Frenchman and said branded wine in France, French branded wine's a contradiction in terms. So that was Pied d'Or. This is an idea that I developed with a couple of colleagues. We looked around at, we set ourselves the objective of developing a brand of our own. And we looked around the market and discovered that most categories were being premiumized. But the one category that was not being premiumized was cream liqueurs. So we said, why don't we produce a super premium cream liqueur? It will be 40% above Bailey's in price, 40% below Bailey's in sweetness, and it would look completely different. We produced a brand called Cool Swan, which is still on the market today. It's waiting for somebody to buy it. It's a white cream liqueur, so if there are any mixologists out here, it produces the best cream cocktails there are because it doesn't make every one of them look brown and cloudy. And its time will come. Oh, here's the last brief, which is, I think, one of my proudest moments, although the idea came to absolutely nothing. When Diageo was formed, there was a lot of talk, a lot of hands across the sea. What can we do? How can we synergize our skills? And one of the things on the table was to do a Guinness whiskey. And the debate was whether it should be Scotch or Irish. Now, the answer to the debate was it had to be Irish. But the problem was that the company didn't own any Irish whiskey. So in other words, if they developed a successful product, it would be out there making Pernod Ricard rich, which I don't think was part of their agenda. And the solution came from all those interminable times that you spend going around whiskey distilleries. I mean, once you've been to one, you get incredibly bored. But I had this idea. Has anyone here been around a whiskey distillery? Show of hands? A few. Now, the first stage in making a whiskey is you make a beer. And then you distill the beer. It's as simple as that. So I thought, well, why don't we simply take Guinness and distill it? And we came up with distilled Guinness, which has a huge number of advantages. One, it doesn't, you can make it anywhere, because Guinness is the provenance, not Ireland. So if you make Guinness in Nigeria, you can make distilled Guinness in Nigeria. You're not controlled by the Scotch Whisky Association or the Irish Whisky Association. You can make it taste any way you like. And I suppose the most positive idea is the fact that you can make it today and drink it tomorrow. There's no 3-year limitation on that. Now, I presented that idea on the 1st of November 1998. Nothing has yet happened, but maybe somebody out here in the beer business would like to have a look. So what next? I think it would be presumptuous of me to say what's going to happen next in the business. I haven't been in it for about 10 years, so I don't have my finger on the pulse. But I have a few thoughts as what I would like to happen, or what I think is going on, and I'll share them with you here. I think somebody will eventually grab hold of rum and do for rum what Patron did for tequila. Oh. My second point is that I think with gin, I walk around this conference and there are so many different gin brands. And I think the problem with gin for me is that there are too many ideas and not enough innovation. I mean, I've seen chocolate orange flavored gin. I've probably seen veal gravy flavored gin. There's just too much out there. The people are just throwing different gins from different places at consumers, and the bubble's going to burst. There's just too much. One of the things I hate about the business are terms like handcrafted and batch distilled and 5 times distilled. I don't think the consumers really are interested in that kind of thing. I think they're interested in benefits, not processes. I mean, who believes that something from Diageo is handcrafted? It's an enormous global company. They don't have the time or the opportunity to handcraft anything. And if people put batch distilled, that usually means it's a loser. It's not doing very well. So I'd like to see that gone. I think someone will distill a well-known beer brand and create a new category. That's a hope, as opposed to a prediction. I think old-fashioned USPs will come back. I mean, I worked for Unilever and I worked for Procter & Gamble, and I really believe that if you say this product is different and better and functionally superior to other products, I think that will happen again. I think companies will use better adjectives to differentiate their products. I saw a whiskey the other day which described itself as sweet and smoky, and I thought, wow, what a courageous thing to do. They might alienate people who don't like that, but I think the adjective is going to come back. I think non-alcoholic products will grow, but I think the products will have to be better than the ones that are out there now. I think the ones that are out there now are pretty disappointing. And I think the key to that is when somebody realizes that drinks products don't have to taste nice. There was one problem with Bailey's when we first did it. Sir Anthony Tennant, the late Sir Anthony Tennant, took a bottle of Bailey's to New York, to our man in New York, who was one of the titans of the business, and presented it to him. He looked at the pack, he tasted the product, and he said, "That shit will never sell." And I thought that was a great idea for a title for a book. And that's this is my book. And I have a few copies here if anybody's interested in. It contains all the ideas there, plus about another 60 or 70. And many of them, I think, are available for somebody to take on. So thank you all very much for listening to me.
Check, 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 Thomas. All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Thomas. Am I on? All right. Fabulous.
And if anyone has any questions.
Exactly. Time for a few questions. Right over here. Anyone? I have a question. So you were saying, so you were working for the company for so long, and you were creating all these ideas and not getting a cent from any of these products.
Well,
is that true?
I was paid a very good income for working, so
right.
I have no complaints over that.
And is that why you didn't go off on your own?
No, I think the company got a bit tired of me. Well, you know, I can be quite tiresome at times. So I think I didn't operate the way modern companies work. I always had one idea in response to a brief, never more than one. And the company was uncomfortable with that. I didn't do very much research. I did very little research. And the company was uncomfortable with that. So we parted ways. Our ideologies drifted apart.
Huh, interesting. Anybody else have any? Yes, a gentleman in the back. I will be right there.
Thank you for a great presentation. Just a quick question. Some of these examples you showed, you had a lot of, you talked about like unique selling points, product benefits. How about like brand, like lifestyle marketing? Was that part of the proposals
I can't hear
as well?
you very well.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is that better? So you talked a lot about unique selling points and product benefits for a lot of these products that you developed. What about like brand lifestyle marketing? Was that part of the proposal as well?
I don't think I understand that. I mean, I think it's presumptuous to say that one understands lifestyle. Would be for me anyway. I mean, I was looking to deliver a brand that offered people a tangible benefit. And I think there's a lot to be said for, I like this gin because it tastes fresher than any other gin. Or I like this vodka because it's smoother than other people. I think lifestyle benefits are often created by advertising agencies because they can't think of strong USPs for brands. But it's a good question. Sorry, I couldn't answer it differently.
That answer was perfect.
Hey, if anybody would like to buy a copy of my book, it's available outside.
Just a question regarding idea processing. Like, when do you have an idea? Do you already know by gut feeling it will be perfect, or is it developing during the process? Because you mentioned like 30 seconds for inventing Baileys. Do you know already it would be a success?
You never know. You never know whether an idea is a success at that stage in its life. You take a guess, but the more important point is the person who buys the idea, the client. He takes the biggest guess. I think one of the things you realize about ideas is that the real heroes are not the people who have them, but the people who buy them. If you're a client and you buy a way out idea, you're the hero because you're putting your job on the line. And I think it's one of my salutary lessons in all my time.
All right, thanks.
All right, be right there. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you for the excellent explanations. How important do you rate a brand story or creating a brand story once you found the name and the benefits you attach to the product to be?
I think stories are important, and my book is just full of stories, and it's about being truthful. I mean, I think that I've always tried to seek the truth. There was a story with that Aqualibre brand where my client said, could we put made from a special Swiss recipe on it? And I said, no, we can't, because it's not true. But he insisted on putting made with a special Swiss recipe, and a journalist found out and demanded to see it. So I think I've always tried to tell the truth with every development that I've done. Does that answer your question? Any more? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Thomas. Thanks a lot for your presentation. In the topic, it means what works, why doesn't, what next. If I read your book, do I get more answers about it? And do you differentiate the different markets like US, Asia, Europe? Because we're creating also brands, and that would be interesting for us.
I don't think I can predict the future. I think that there are people out there who, I mean, you're going to hear a talk by the guy from Fever Tree. And what an amazing story that is. I mean, somebody said, why should Schweppes dominate the tonic market? It's huge. Let's develop a new one. I mean, there are people out there with very simple, straightforward, brilliant ideas. I can't tell you what's next. My book will tell you what's been, and will tell you a whole host of ideas that haven't happened yet, but should be taken up. And there are lots of stories. I mean, it's about how ideas happen.
Fantastic. That's great. Let's have another round of applause, please, for Mr. David Gluckmann. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation.